Hey, and welcome back to the Surfline podcast. I am Surfline lead forecaster Korte, and I'm joined here in our Outer Banks, North Carolina office with forecaster Rob Mitstifer. Rob, we got a lot going on in the Atlantic. I know some of the attention's over and what's happening on the North Shore of Hawaii. But you know what? You and I, we don't really worry too much about that. We're more concerned about the Atlantic basin. Lots going on there over the past week or so. Why don't you run down what we got going on?
Yeah, Kurt, like you mentioned, Hawaii has been kind of a hot spot this week, but if you've been paying close attention to our forecasts, we've been mentioning kind of a really active pattern that's developed over the central Atlantic over the past really week or so, and it's still ongoing today, and that's delivered a lot of swell across the whole basin, and we'll get into that, what we're expecting going forward as far as Caribbean and East Coast related surf. But just to start things off, I'm going to go over what we saw happen in the central Atlantic. So we've seen basically back-to-back really impressive storm systems develop over the central Atlantic, and that's kind of roughly the region in the Atlantic that's about 1,500 to 2,000 miles away from the East Coast. So we're talking pretty far offshore. These storms really never impact our local winds directly, but they do often send swell, especially if they're strong enough like the ones we just saw. So the first storm we saw last week, it was pretty strong. The Ocean Prediction Center analyzed it with peak winds around 50 knots during the meat of the swell generation, and that storm actually ended up developing into a tropical system. It became Hurricane Pablo over the weekend as it kind of lifted off to the northeast on the other side of the Azores. So once it made it to the west, or once it made it over to the east side of the Atlantic there, it started to weaken. But as that happened, we saw a second storm move in right behind the first one, and that second storm is still going on today. Really large, really strong storm, had maximum winds up in hurricane force, so that's greater than 64 knots, so really strong storm, and that swell is actually propagating across the Atlantic right now. Kurt, we just looked at some of the buoys in the Atlantic and noticed it was starting to rise. So we've had swell in the water from the first storm for the past few days, but this next one looks a little bit stronger. Do you mind talking about what's been going on in the Caribbean the last few days and what we got going forward?
Yeah, this is a kind of a unique swell direction. A lot of times in the winter for the Caribbean, you're looking at north or northwest swells from the storm activity moving off the East Coast. But you have a system that sets up over in the central Atlantic or kind of near the Azores. You can get a northeast swell. And there actually are a handful of spots that really like that swell direction. Longer period energy really amplified at some of the breaks. One prime example is Wilderness in Puerto Rico. Really likes that northeast direction and longer period. Kind of the better for there. So we saw some pretty solid video from down there at Wildo the past couple of days, and I would suspect this next one is going to be as big, if not a notch or two bigger there. So should see some pretty solid waves down in Puerto Rico going forward, but also some of the other islands. There's some spots in the BVIs, the Lesser Antilles. We saw our Soup Bowl cam was cam of the day the past couple of days. Some bomb and surf down there.
Yeah.
Going to see another round of that come up, actually maybe a little more maxed out there for Soup Bowl. If you haven't checked it out, we've actually upgraded that cam, and it's the quality of it's much better than it was. We finally got some better internet in to our host location, so it's a great cam to kind of watch and just kind of geek out and wish that you were there.
Yeah, that's absolutely a great cam. And the one interesting thing about what we were looking at today, that the first swell is in the water, it's starting to fade now, but that's actually the same swell that sent waves for the finals day of the contest in Portugal. Now, Kurt, you were actually over in Portugal during that run of swell.
I was.
Leading up to that run of swell, forecasting for the World Surf League event. So what were kind of the challenges you were looking at with that swell, just briefly? Yeah,
so the contest was, of course, at Super Tubos, which is in Peniche, and one of the hard things about forecasting Super Tubes is, well, the wind forecast can be kind of a joke over there, but swell direction is incredibly important for a place like Super Tubes because you actually have a little peninsula and some offshore islands that sit off there, and also a little canyon that can kind of play havoc on anything with any kind of north in it. So the storm that set up that initial one near the Azores, we saw actually a really good direction, west to west southwest. Pretty much comes in there unimpeded, and the finals day on Saturday kind of pumped, and it looked really good. So it's always interesting. You think about a storm that that side of the Atlantic, and it also is sending pumping waves down in the Caribbean, and a little bit of that swell actually impacting the East Coast as well, though kind of most spots not seeing the best conditions here the past couple of days.
Yeah, it's really interesting because you think about these storms, a lot of times if you're on a forecasting, you're looking at one specific side of the storm. So for us East Coasters, all we really care about is the side of the storm with winds directed at us, right? So, but of course, in an ideal scenario, a storm...
How selfish,
right?
Yeah.
In an ideal storm scenario, the swell is going to be sending out waves in all directions. So, Portugal got a west-southwest swell. Barbados, the Caribbean got a northeast to north-northeast swell. And on our buoys right now, there's a little bit of east swell reading from that same storm. So now let's move on to this next storm that we still have going on today. A little bit of a larger storm. The winds were definitely a little bit stronger. And also, another key factor is it's going to be actually a longer-lived storm, at least a really respectable longer-lived storm. We did see the last one develop into a tropical system, and that actually may end up happening with this next one, but we've seen that we really don't care what these storms are called as long as there is wind over the water. So, Kurt, what are you seeing on the forecast? I know you're on part of the East Coast forecast today. What are you seeing with the resulting swell of this second storm, and what are the conditions looking like on the East Coast timing-wise? What can we go over so far?
Yeah, so back to the variables that you mentioned, the fact that it's a slightly stronger storm over an agitated sea state, a little bit bigger of a storm. You would initially think that the swell that's going to end up from this storm is going to end up being a little bit bigger in a little bit longer period than what we saw from the last one. And in many locations, that's going to be what's going to happen. You'll see a little bit bigger surf down in the Caribbean, and then if you're here on the East Coast, we're expecting a little bit longer period pulse. We were just kind of eyeing some of the offshore buoys. Should see that move in during the middle part of the week, continue into the back half of the week, and then things will kind of fade down over the weekend. But as is typically the case here, that's not the only thing going on. We have a frontal system that's going to be impacting us here later in the week and into the weekend, and that's going to really play a major role in what zones see the best surf for us. But there will be some of that longer period energy in the water that's going to mix in with some of that more locally generated wind swell around that frontal system.
Yeah, so realistically, looks like a lot of the East Coast and Caribbean is going to have days of waves ahead. So definitely make sure to check out that forecast, updated twice daily forecasts and reports on the Surfline site and app. So other than that, Kurt, I think we can round this off. I hope everyone gets some waves in the next few days and have a good week.